Hello, hello, hello everybody. Welcome back to my channel. It's me, Rachel, the Student Witch. How are you doing? I'm apologizing right off the bat for the light situation. I'm next to the window in our office, and so like half of my face is illuminated and the other half is in shadow, but that's just how it's gonna have to be. And I also want to apologize right off the bat for the tardiness in uploading this video. I aim to upload my book review videos at the end of every month. So basically, if you are new to the channel or you haven't subscribed yet, I put up a poll up on YouTube, and I also put up a vote on my Instagram, which is linked below, by the way, to allow my subscribers and followers to vote for the book that I read for every month. And then I try to put up the book review at the end of that month. So for September, I read The Inward Arc. As you can see by the title of this video, it's a book about transpersonal psychology, and I'll get into what that is in general here in a second. But I was late this time around because 2 weeks ago I woke up with a sore throat, and then it was just, I felt like shit for over a week after that. I'm new to the Southern Hemisphere. I just moved to Chile with my partner a few months ago, and so for anyone out there who's also moved to a part of the world that you're not used to, you know that that part of the world has different like cold and flu viruses circulating, you know, different from the ones that you're used to in your home country or region or whatever. And so if you get sick with a cold, it hits you twice as hard because your body's just not used to that particular strand of the virus, right? And so that's what happened to me. I had a fever, and after finally the sore throat and the fever went away, it was sneezing and coughing forever. So I finally have my voice back. I'm 95% over with the coughing, still coughing sometimes at night and in the morning, but I'm mostly back. And so I appreciate your patience. To make it up to you guys, I'm actually going to make October a very book reviewy month. So of course today I'm going to be talking about The Inward Arc. Then in a week or so, by mid-October, I'm going to be talking finally about Pregnant Darkness, Alchemy and the Rebirth of Consciousness by Monica Wickman. I don't know if you can see that very well. There, that's better. I've been meaning to do a review of this book for months because this is perhaps one of the most important spiritual books I've read ever, and definitely the most important I've read so far in 2019. And I'll get into that for the review for this video. So be on the lookout for that. For this book's review in mid-October. And then by the end of October, I'll get around to doing the book review for this month's read, which you guys voted for, Libra, Null, and Psychonaut, An Introduction to Chaos Magic by Peter J. Carroll. And this book has been on my TBR list, my to-be-read list for ages, like years. So I'm finally getting around to it, and I'm so excited to finally dive in. So before diving into the specifics and my notes for The Inward Arc, which I took multiple pages of, I basically just kind of wrote down notes for every chapter. Let's talk about what is transpersonal psychology. And so I'm going to offer my very limited definition of it because I'm not a psychologist, just throwing that out there. But then I'm also going to read a little bit off of the Wikipedia page for transpersonal psychology, which I will include the link for that down below, just as an overview of what the heck is transpersonal psychology. So really quickly, transpersonal psychology, I first came across this term, and that led me to finding this book. Probably about 2 years ago I actually bought this book, and I finally just now finished it. Transpersonal psychology is something I came across a couple years ago because I was just looking into what my options were when it comes to finding a therapist, and that didn't lead anywhere. But I did come across resources for this thing called transpersonal psychology. I was also interested in and kind of going down the internet rabbit hole about, altered states of consciousness and their effect on psychology and the therapeutic benefits of using substances that cause altered states of consciousness within a clinical and safe setting for healing from trauma or facing existential dread. The research that's thankfully becoming more and more prevalent now about how cancer patients that know that they're going to die soon, participating in these studies, taking psilocybin or taking LSD, and finding that the experience is helping them cope with their existential crisis, so to speak, or something like that. I was interested in that, and that led me to transpersonal psychology. And basically, if I had to funnel everything down into a very succinct statement of my own definition of transpersonal psychology, it would be this. Transpersonal psychology is a branch of psychology that values spiritual experiences, spiritual practice, and the importance of spirituality for overall health and well-being. It's not just mental and emotional health, it's not just physical health, there's also a spiritual component to health. And it's important to note for any atheists in my audience that this is not a prescribed spirituality. It's not a specific spiritual path. This is non-denominational, because transpersonal psychology recognizes that any spiritual path, particularly those esoteric or inward-focused paths or the mystical branches of more popular religions like the Abrahamic religions or Hinduism or anything like that, the esoteric branches and mystical branches of those religions are particularly helpful as potential paths for the individual to explore themselves, transcend the ego, and I'll get into what that means here in a second, and experience that transpersonal awareness, that truth, that this concept of an individual self, this duality that we struggle with of self and other, that which is me versus everything that is not me, is just a construction. And so that's what transcendence means in transpersonal psychology, according to me, in my own words, is that it's transcending an individual, separate sense of self and coming into an awareness of unity, of being part of the all, of being one with everything, which is what a lot of those mystical traditions, Gnostic traditions, Zen Buddhism and Buddhist psychology also talks about. And I actually see how these mystical traditions and esoteric traditions and definitely Buddhism have had a huge influence on transpersonal psychology. So that really helped me to, I've learned a lot of this by reading this book. That really helped me to kind of heal my relationship with the concept of transcendence itself, because I grew up Roman Catholic with all that dogma and shit drilled into my head, right? And so according to the exoteric teachings or dogma of Roman Catholicism, right, the outward looking, the social aspects, the dogma, the rules and regulations of a religion, right? Transcendence means that the realm of God, the very male patriarchal God, is more holy, more pure, cleaner, sanctified than physical reality. The reality of our bodies, the reality of living on this planet, on this earth. Like, that's what transcendence meant for the exoteric perspective of Abrahamic Christianity or Abrahamic monotheism, right? However, if you look at things from an esoteric perspective, from the mystical, from a transpersonal perspective, transcendence means realizing that you are more than just your thoughts. You are more than just your individual ego. It is transcending the duality of self and other. And I'm using the word other very generally to mean everything that is not me. For example, this wine in this wine glass is not me. This cell phone is not me. These books are not me. These curtains and window, it's not me. It is other. It's the duality of self and not self. It's transcending that duality and coming into an awareness or a realization, a visualization, an experience of unity that often escapes words. Like words are not enough to explain or describe these types of mystical experiences, ecstatic experiences, right? So that really helped me to kind of feel more comfortable with the word transcendence and to recognize the importance of these types of intuitions or awareness experiences, ecstatic states, or just knowing that you are part of a greater unity of everything, right? So let's see just in the first two paragraphs of the Wikipedia page about transpersonal psychology what it says. And again, I'll include the link to this down below. Transpersonal psychology is a subfield or school of psychology that integrates the spiritual and transcendent aspects of the human experience with the framework of modern psychology. It is also possible to define it as a spiritual psychology. The transpersonal is defined as experience, quote, experiences in which the sense of identity or self extends beyond, that's where the trans part comes from, the individual or personal to encompass wider aspects of humankind, life, psyche, or cosmos. It has also been defined as development beyond conventional, personal, or individual levels. And so there's a list of, the focuses or what transpersonal psychology focuses on: spiritual and self-development, the self beyond ego, peak experiences, mystical experiences, spiritual crises, trance states, spiritual evolution, altered states of consciousness, religious conversion, spiritual practices, and other sublime and or unusually expanded experiences of living. And then you can read on if you want to know more, but that in general is transpersonal psychology, and I'm really attracted to this branch of psychology, this field of exploring the self in relation to everything, right? And that's what led me down the rabbit hole to this book. So now let me just give an overview of in general what each chapter of this book talks about, just very generally. So let's start off with the introduction. So in the introduction, she talks about what is the absolute, the all, the everything, the unity that we are a part of, the implicate order of the totality of experience. And then she talks about the goals of human development, and she kind of breaks down human development into 5 parts. And this, if you watched my review of Eastern Body, Western Mind, which I will link up here in the corner, but also link down below, it was August's book review. The way that Frances Vaughan talks about human self-development is very much like how the author of Eastern Body, Western Mind used the chakra system, the 7 central chakras, as a way to kind of psychologically talk about human development as well. But Frances Vaughan divides things into like 5 realms or 5 stages of development, and that includes the physical self, the emotional self, the mental self, existential self, and then the transpersonal self. And so it's important to note, just like what the author of Eastern Body, Western Mind said, no one chakra or self in terms of this book is more important than the others. You know, the crown chakra is not any more important than the root chakra, right? Every chakra or every realm of self, every component of ourself is equally important. However, the stages of development do kind of build on each other, and so you can't have a healthy sense of transpersonal self without a healthy sense of physical self, a healthy relationship to your body, physical health itself. Even a healthy ego is important for a healthy transpersonal self, because you have to have a healthy sense of self in order to then be able to surpass it, to go beyond it, to build a sense of self that is more encompassing than just your thoughts, than just who you think you are, right? So that's kind of what she goes into in the introduction. Then the first chapter is called Healing the Whole Person, a Psychological Perspective. And in this chapter, she talks about what is transpersonal psychotherapy, and why it is important to have a wider vision of wholeness when it comes to healing and well-being. So she just goes into that a little bit more. Chapter 2 is called Evolution of Self-Concepts, and this is where she really talks about that building up a sense of self throughout our lives, from infancy until we die, hopefully as old adults, right? The body and the emotional self, the egoic self, the existential self, and the transpersonal identity. It really impacted me, this idea that we must be willing to question the assumption that the self is an independent, self-contained, and separate entity. Because I really do feel like, I mean, growing up in Western society, which is all that I know from firsthand experience, we take it as an assumption, or we take it for granted, that our sense of self is actually a thing. But we need to recognize it's a construction, and it's constantly evolving, and that is not everything that we are. We are not just who we think we are. We are not just our relationships to other people. We are not just our body. We are not just a separate, self-contained entity. We are connected to our environment, to our relationships, to the cosmos, right? And so it's important to remember that it is an assumption that we are independent, self-contained, and separate entities, right? And to a certain extent, it's an important and necessary assumption. You know, there are psychological issues and disorders related to, you know, disassociation and not having a healthy enough sense of ego or healthy enough sense of separate self. But it doesn't stop there, right? It's important to remember that transpersonal aspect of self. And so that's what she talks about in chapter 2. And then in chapter 3, which is called the Transpersonal Self, she goes into detail about what she means about the transpersonal self. And here's where we need to amplify our definition of what is self. And so for her, the transpersonal self, or self with a capital S, is this transpersonal, interconnected, expansive, you know, expanding toward unity sense of self, versus self with a little s, which would be more that egoic, separate sense of self. She talks about persona and shadow, and how a healthy egoic identity, which is important, is the healing the split between persona and shadow, and that's where she talks a little bit about shadow work. She talks about disidentification, where you begin to practice not identifying with your thoughts For example, I wrote down, I have thoughts, emotions, and sensations. I think this is a quote from the book. And this is kind of a mantra or a practice that you can do. You can say, I have thoughts, emotions, sensations. I am not my thoughts, emotions, and sensations. And I think this is particularly helpful, I mean, from my perspective as someone with anxiety, social anxiety, but also generalized anxiety, it's important to remember, I have my thoughts, I have my anxious feelings, but I am not my thoughts, I'm not my anxious feelings. And that's what she means by disidentification. And she talks about the transpersonal self as a bridge between the individual and the all, the numinous, the totality, the absolute, right? So the transpersonal self is, and that's why she says the transpersonal self is not abandoning an egoic, individual, separate sense of self. It's building on it. So it is that bridge between the individual self and the all, the numinous, the absolute in her terms, right? Oh, I guess here it's also important for me to mention before I get too much further into this is that a really interesting aspect of this book is that every chapter also includes exercises at the end of each chapter. How does she call them? Experiential exercises. For example, so this is at the end of chapter 3, the transpersonal self. So the experiential exercise. And so for a couple pages, she includes just some final thoughts for, or a mantra, or a thought experiment really, that you can try to practice what she's talking about in that particular chapter. And so every single chapter has these experiential exercises at the end, which I think is really nice. It kind of makes it less of a theoretical text and more of a text slash but also kind of workbook. It like involves the reader more in the book, which I really appreciate. So chapter 4 is called Healing Awareness, and this is really where she talks about what I would call as mindfulness. And I know mindfulness meditation is kind of like a hot thing right now, but with good reason, because healing awareness allows you to observe in a non-judgmental way, observe your thoughts and practice that disassociation that she was talking about. Again, this isn't the disordered kind of disassociation. This is realization that I have thoughts, but I'm not my thoughts. I'm more than just my thoughts, right? And here's a quote that I wrote down from page 62. Healing awareness depends on a willingness to acknowledge the truth about oneself at all levels. And so this is just self-observation, self-study, awareness of self that is non-judgmental, but it is through this awareness that healing can occur. Chapter 5 is called In the Pursuit of Happiness. And here is really interesting because she talks about pleasure and how we need to re-examine our attitudes around pleasure and activities that cause us pleasure and happiness. And then she goes into bliss and ecstasy, which would be these like mystical, ecstatic states of unity, of oneness, right? And so she says, basically, the greatest spiritual pleasure is found in transcendence of duality, the realization of unity, which I found really interesting. Chapter 6 is called Mapping the Spiritual Path. And here she offers different metaphors or different, what she calls maps from different traditions that all kind of say the same thing. And this is what I mean by transpersonal psychology being non-denominational. You know, she explicitly says that, you know, the path that you choose doesn't necessarily matter because all mystical, esoteric, spiritual paths kind of lead to the same destination, which is these the spiritual pleasure of experiencing unity, right? And so she offers Christian metaphors, the chakra system as an option, and then ox herding pictures from Zen Buddhism, which I had never heard of, which was really interesting. So she picks 3 different spiritual maps from 3 different traditions and cultures, and shows how these maps talk about self-development, talk about the transpersonal self, and unity with the all, and healing. Chapter 7, Guidance on the Path. This chapter was really interesting. I found it incredibly interesting because I watched recently a little documentary about cults. And so around the same time that I was reading this chapter, and so in this chapter she explicitly talks about, and sorry, probably the traffic noise is really loud. I live right next to a really busy street. But she explicitly talks about how to find an appropriate spiritual teacher if you feel a calling to find a spiritual teacher, and how to avoid some of the abuses that can happen with spiritual teachers, or when spiritual teachers are put up on a platform, or when one spiritual path is proclaimed to be the one and only way to the truth when that's not the case. So she talks about some of the pitfalls and dangers of working with like self-proclaimed gurus or spiritual teachers. She even talks about some of the pitfalls and problems with working with spiritual paths themselves. Like I said, when you over-identify too much with one particular path and start thinking that that one path is the one and only way to the truth, then you've kind of lost your way, right? And then the path can actually become, the path itself and your relationship to it can actually become a hindrance in your spiritual healing and your journey in this life. So I thought that was really interesting. Chapter 8 is called Creativity and Dreaming. And so creativity for her is where the relationship between the mundane and the transcendent is explicitly revealed. And I think it's really interesting how she connected creativity with dreaming, with the dream state. Because she says that dreams can have a creative and healing function. And then she talks a little bit about the importance of intuition, and she defines intuition as a way of knowing that transcends empirical and rational modes of knowing. And then there was a section about initiation dreams, like having dreams about being initiated or going through some sort of shamanic or initiation process. That is a way for the psyche or the subconscious or what have you to communicate to you that you are ready to take on this new journey or ready to go on a spiritual path. It was just really interesting, that section, because it caused me to kind of sit and reflect on past dreams that I've had that would actually fit into that category. And then chapter 9 is called Healing Relationships. And this chapter was really poignant to me because I have that social anxiety. Excuse me. And because I have trust issues with people, I have issues letting people in. I have issues being vulnerable with people. And so she goes into some issues with relationships, and this isn't just romantic relationships, it's relationships in general. Some of the defenses that people have going into relationships, and these like projection, denial, reaction formation, repression, rationalization, and regression. And how, from a transpersonal perspective, how healing relationships can actually be, but it requires a sense of love, a sense of openness. And so it really got me to thinking about how some of the shadowy stuff that I still deal with when it comes to relationships and building friendships and trusting people and being vulnerable and being open with people, which I'm not so good at. And so that chapter was really important to realize how relationships can be healing. I shouldn't come at building new friendships and relationships from a place of fear, from a place of assuming that the person's going to hurt me, but rather from an openness, right? And then in chapter 10, which is the final chapter, it's the transpersonal vision. And so she talks about enlightenment as the goal of spiritual paths, spiritual discipline, and a global healing vision is the importance of working on yourself and the greater implications of working on yourself, how that causes a ripple effect in our relationships and how that can really transform society and transform the world. So, all that being said, would I recommend this book? Yes. If you are interested in transpersonal psychology, if you're interested in reading and learning about how spirituality and psychology can come together and form a system for healing and self-knowing and exploration, if you are interested in shadow work, if you're interested in mysticism and ideas of the transcendent and that kind of stuff, mystical experiences, spiritual experiences, the importance of the spiritual practice, I definitely would recommend this book. I enjoyed it. I thought that between reading this book and also reading Eastern Body, Western Mind the previous month, I thought those two books together made a really good pair. I know a lot of my audience is in the Northern Hemisphere and you guys are entering into the shadowy part of the year, and so if you're looking for a good book to read as the days get darker and as maybe you feel a calling to shadow work, I definitely recommend The Inward Arc or Eastern Body, Western Mind. Again, I'll include the link to my video review of Eastern Body, Western Mind down below, but also up here in the cards if you're interested in that. But I'm in the Southern Hemisphere and it's springtime here. And so I'm feeling like the rebirth of the sun and life is blooming. It's time to be active and proactive, right? And so I'm really excited to dive into this book for October's review at the end of the month to get my witch on, but also make some magic. I'm just in a magic making mood. So I'm ready for this for the end of October, and be on the lookout for this book review by mid-October. So, have you read Eastern Body, Western Mind? Are you interested in transpersonal psychology? Have you ever heard of it before? Let me know in the comments down below. And until next time, many blessings. Bye.